All right. Hello, everyone. This is Danny Haiphong. I'm coming to you from the Internationalist Transmission, a program of the Left Lens, the Black Agenda Report's YouTube channel. And today we have a special Easter Sunday, a very holy day for us stream. We are going to be joined by an amazing panel of speakers to talk about Yellow Peril and Red Scare, because as I'm sure all of you who are joining this are aware of, we are experiencing an unprecedented rise in anti-Asian racism, especially over the past year. But what we've noticed, and I'm sure everyone who will be joining me agrees, is that the conversation about anti-Asian racism has been very narrow. It has mostly focused on stopping Asian hate. It is mostly focused on the events that have occurred, the very tragic events and violent events that have unfortunately affected so many people of Asian descent in the United States and the West. But there is a missing context here, a missing historical context, a missing contemporary context that involves US and Western imperialism, and it involves the racism required to justify it among the population. And now we are in the United States and its allies in a drive toward a new Cold War. And many have said we are in a new Cold War. So I'm not going to belabor the point. I want to bring in the panel. But first, I just want to say a few things, a few announcements that I will also announce maybe in the middle and at the end of the stream. First, I want to thank Carlos Martinez and Invent the Future for his Invent the Future blog for helping me put together this stream. He could not be with us to co-host it today. I also want to say that Black Alliance for Peace, speaking of Asia, is holding a day of action to end the U.S. war in Afghanistan on April 8th. And you can find details in the description at blackallianceforpeace.com/day of action Afghanistan. And without further ado, I want to bring in my panel today. So I'm just going to exit. Hello, everyone. Good to see all of you. We have Xiangyu, we have Amanda Yi, we have Charles from Qiao Collective, we have Sheila Xiao from Pivot to Peace, and Carl Za. And I'm just going to get right to it. Let's ask the first question, and that is, what are some of the factors that have led to the rise in anti-Asian racism? We've seen thousands of attacks that have been documented, at least in the last year. And now it is receiving mainstream coverage from the U.S. media and the U.S. presidency, Joe Biden administration. But what's missing here? And I want to go to you first, Carl, if you could just introduce what's missing here from the conversation, because I feel like there's so much we could get at. Oh, you're muted. Carl,
You're muted.
Hi again. I'm Carl. I don't think it's so much of a rise in anti-Asian racism as a rise in manifestation of anti-Asian racism, because the anti-Asian racism has always been there in the U.S. society. It has never left. It's after COVID. I think it give a pretense excuse for all the racists to come out of the woodworks, and that's helped along by rhetorics coming from the White House, during the Trump administration, when the U.S. government is trying to shift blame toward China on its own inept handling of the COVID crisis here in the United States. That kind of emboldens all the races and create an atmosphere of permissiveness. But as we all know, anti-Asian racism has always been present, and in general, even tolerated in the U.S. I think the reason for that, and there's many reasons for that, but one of the reasons why it persisted is because there's very little consequences for anti-Asian racism and even anti-Asian violence in the United States. What we're seeing today is really, like a accumulation of everything coming together.
Yeah, can I jump in?
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Oh, unless you want to say something.
No, no, no.
Oh.
Hold on one second. I don't know what is going on here. Sorry about that. All right, here we go. I think I removed Carl by accident, but
yeah. I just wanted to add that anti-Asian racism is nothing new, like Carl said. We've seen, I would say, anti-Asian racism began when the first Chinese workers immigrated here to the States to dig for gold, build the railroads. At that time, there was a lot of resentment against the Chinese workers among the white working class because they saw them as competition in terms of looking for work. So, I mean, they were ostracized, but not only that, they were also scapegoated for different public health crises. And they were seen as racialized carriers of infectious illnesses. They were blamed for outbreaks of cholera and smallpox and the bubonic plague. So when Trump called COVID-19 the China virus and blamed Chinese people for the pandemic, it wasn't something that had happened completely out of isolation. It's part of this long history of Chinese people being scapegoated for disease outbreaks that goes back all the way back to Chinese immigration. And, it's part of this long history of Chinese people being seen as dirty, diseased. And if you remember, a year ago, when the pandemic first happened, there was a lot of really sensationalist coverage of the wet markets in China, and just a really large focus on their dietary habits and their hygienic practices, because it sort of it kind of fit the stereotype that Americans already had of Chinese people as dirty and barbaric, and as carriers of disease.
Yeah, indeed. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Yeah, I do.
All right, Xiangyu.
So I think Amanda made a really good point about how anti-Asian racism began when the first Chinese workers came to the United States. Now, one thing I really want to emphasize is when people from different national backgrounds are in the same space, and had to interact with one another, it's inevitable that there's going to be mutual misunderstandings and even sometimes animosity. But the thing is, the main factor when it comes to racism is what do systems of power do about this? Do they try to let these people reach a mutual understanding and resolve conflicts, or do they sweep them under the rug, or do they use them to their advantage to maintain their class rule? So yeah, that's just something I wanted to point out there. And these ideas, racist ideas, don't fall from the sky. It's oftentimes they're used as justification for U.S. foreign policy. It's just something I wanted to add.
That's a very good point, because anti-Asian racism is not just something that happened within the U.S. borders. It's because U.S. have been participating in imperialist wars in Asia for over 100 years now, and that consequences feeds back when impoverished Asian immigrants that come to the United States, and we've seen this. We've seen this in popular culture, in a supposedly anti-war war movie like the Full Metal Jacket. which is supposedly the anti-Vietnam War, we have that infamous scene of the sex workers approaching the American GIs and saying, "Oh, me love you long time," and that has been instead been co-opted into the popular culture, and then that's something that average American public used to denigrate Asians, in particular Asian women, and this is all tied with the okay. I maybe Amanda can add to that, because I feel like I feel like a bit inadequate to speak about the issues of gender.
Well, let me just jump in and say first, if panelists, when they speak, just introduce yourself quickly. I didn't want to go and spend a lot of time on that, but make sure you do that next time you speak. But maybe we could move on to this next question, because I think it is, it really gets to exactly what you're speaking about, Carl. I feel like not being talked about at all is this relationship between racism, these attacks, especially toward women of Asian descent, and the history of what has been a sexualized imperialist history of the United States and the West. I mean, Carl, what you just said, that line, I heard that throughout my childhood. I mean, in terms, like, back to the context of imperialism, the word gook, for example, I'm a Vietnamese descent, and I heard that all throughout my childhood. And people should read this great article by David Roediger, who wrote in the 90s about the origins of it. And you can trace it back to the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, which is another brutal occupation that the United States participated in the late 19th century, into World War II. So, but without further ado, I think Amanda and Sheila, if you could, I would love, if you feel comfortable speaking about this. Can you talk about this relationship, because it's not being talked about at all, and we've seen the media do this? Is it a question of women and sex workers being attacked, isolated from race, or is it race? Can we clarify the relationship between all of this? I don't know who wants to go first, Amanda or Sheila, if you want to speak to this issue.
I can take a stab at it, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I'll just introduce myself. My name is Sheila. I am Chinese American. I'm a researcher, community organizer, and co-founder of the organization Pivot to Peace. And yeah, definitely, the history of sexualized imperialist violence towards Asian women is a huge factor in what we saw in Atlanta. And, and I just kind of want to take it back a step, in fact, this hate crime happens in the context of a deeply misogynistic, violent society in which crimes against women are often glossed over as hate crimes, right? The fact that this guy killed women based on eliminating temptation is not seen as a hate crime is atrocious to us as women. In the United States, intimate partner violence accounts for 50% of female homicides. That's 50%. And this is just so, this form of violence in itself against women in the United States is so desensitized to what it really means. And then here we have the racial factor, right? Any Asian woman, and I'm sure Amanda, you can attest to this, in the United States can really attest to the disgusting fetishization and harassment that we face nearly daily when we're out on the street, almost specifically because we are Asian. And this, as folks have mentioned, speaks to this century-old fetishization and objectification that we face, right? This comes from a tradition of US colonization of Asian countries, right? I think that the American psyche is built on this global supremacy and American exceptionalism. And it is no surprise then that racist and sexist sentiments of global domination of Asian countries first get manufactured here at home, right? When Asian women were trafficked to create entire sex industries for US military bases, for GIs, right? For easy, cheap, convenient service for US GIs. And it really is no wonder why this fantasy of Asian women, this sexualized image, is so pervasive in US society. And I just wanted to add, this didn't just start on the basis of global domination, right? A lot of people know about the Chinese Exclusion Act, but not many people know about the exclusion of Asian women. And this happened under the 1875 Page Act in the United States, where Chinese and Japanese women posed a threat to the institution of marriage because we were already mischaracterized and defamatized as prostitutes. And, you know, in reality, these women were immigrating for what reason do people immigrate? For better economic opportunities, to reunite with their husbands who had immigrated to the US for the gold rush, right? For the railroads, for cheap labor. So, you know, the complete denigration of Asian women is woven into the fabric of US culture and society. And we cannot separate this from what happened in Atlanta.
Yeah, I'd like to add to what Sheila said. Sheila mentioned the Page Act of 1875. This was also referred to as the Oriental Exclusion Act, and it basically barred entry to undesirable immigrants. And as Sheila said, it primarily targeted East Asian women. There was a sex work industry that involved East Asian women in Chinatown because a lot of the Chinese workers who immigrated here, they paid a broker to come here. And so all of the money that they made would go back to repaying the broker. And a lot of them couldn't afford to bring their families over because of that. So there was a sex work industry that catered to these like Chinese laborers in Chinatown because of that. But because of that, like all East Asian women were seen as sex workers. And so this Page Act of 1875, it was really the first restrictive immigration law that was passed in the United States. It predated the Oriental Exclusion Act, or sorry, not the Oriental Exclusion Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Page Act was called the Oriental Exclusion Act. But yeah, the sex work industry created a moral panic among white Americans. And even the American Medical Association actually believed Chinese sex workers and Chinese women in general would pass what they call Chinese diseases to white clientele. So that was really the basis for that legislation. But going back to the Atlanta shooting, there was a real effort to remove race as any kind of motivating factor from the entire narrative. You know, if you listen to what the police and the shooter said that he wanted to eliminate any sort of sexual temptation because he had a sex addiction. And so he had targeted these Asian spa workers. And like when the story first came out, they were spa workers, but there was no evidence that they were sex workers. But when the story was released, a lot of people assumed that they were sex workers. And you know, there's obviously nothing wrong with sex work, but I think it's very telling that a lot of people automatically assumed that they were sex workers. And it's because of this stereotype of Asian women as like hypersexualized, fetishized, and always seen as objects of sexual desire or temptation. And as Sheila mentioned, there is a link between that and imperialist forces waging wars in Asia and forcing women into sex work, serving these imperialist armies. So from the French occupation of Indochina to Korean comfort women serving Japanese soldiers during the Japanese occupation, to American wars waged in Vietnam, Korea, and Laos, the relation that men of these colonizing forces had to these women in these colonized countries was one of commercial and sexual access. At one point, the sex work industry accounted for like 25% of South Korea's economy, and it included 1 million women. And it became a key part in its economic development of that country. If you like look at, that musical Miss Saigon, that image of like the hypersexualized Asian woman is like very prevalent throughout. Miss Saigon is a musical that was created by the French during the Vietnam War, and it's about a Vietnamese girl who works in a brothel who falls in love with an American soldier. And she's a girl. In the original story, she's 17 years old. She's only 17 years old, and she works in a brothel. In later, more modern adaptations, they change her age to 18 or 19. But in the original story, she was 17. So yeah, that's, there is like a certain history here of Asian women always being like fetishized. And I think that is not being brought up enough when we talk about the shootings in Atlanta. And I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself again. I'm Amanda. I'm Chinese American. I'm cat content only on Twitter. So.
Yeah, Radio Free Amanda. Thank you. Thank you so much for that analysis. It's so important. Maybe it's a good time to now, because I feel like there is this long history that isn't being talked about at all. And I think, Amanda, you and Sheila, you really hit on a lot of key points in the history of U.S. and Western interventionism and imperialism and its relationship to this. The idea of these Korean women who were killed so maliciously and viciously by, the assailant on March 16th, the fact that it was assumed that they were sex workers is a very key point that I don't think a lot of people have been thinking about, especially on our side of the world. But let's move into this propaganda war with China and this new Cold War with China, because as all of this has been happening, there has these attacks on Asian Americans. There has been an escalating aggressive posture by the United States and the West and all of its allies, including forces like the Quad, India, Japan, etc. And this, I think, is the most controversial aspect of this, trying to connect this anti-China sentiment, this dip in public opinion toward China in the United States and the West, in places like Australia especially, with this kind of violence, right? A lot of people do not, across the political mainstream, do not want to touch this. So I want to go to you, Charles, if so, to talk about this, because I feel like everything we've talked about so far kind of leads us to this question of like, why now? Why is China so scapegoated? Why was it scapegoated during the COVID-19 pandemic throughout this year plus long period where the world has been battling this virus? And what's really going on here? Why is the U.S. and its partners so aggressively anti-China? And for all of you who are joining us, and thank you so much for joining us, you may be aware that this stream was already attacked by forces who are claiming this is a CCP oriented panel, and we've already been attacked by the New Lines Institute and by the ASPI just for talking about this connection. So I think it's important to do so, because there are a lot of people who say, well, we're not racist towards Chinese or towards Asians, but we're anti-Communist Party of China, and the Chinese government is equally as racist and bad. So Charles, help us understand this if you can.
Absolutely. Thanks, Danny. And thanks to Black Lines for Peace for hosting this. My name is Charles. I'm a member of the Qiao Collective, which is, a left media collective of diaspora Chinese living in the West, predominantly, on the stolen land of the United States, as well as Britain, and formed in order to challenge precisely what you're talking about, Danny, the sort of unilateral imperial U.S. military aggression on China. I kind of want to start actually by tying in some of the responses that we already heard to the previous two questions into here in sort of a broader historical perspective. And the point at which I would start actually is not, maybe the conventional one of, the US's actual military encirclement of China, which, we can definitely get into in depth and we will later. But perhaps unconventionally with what is presented as a purely domestic policy, namely the Biden administration's recent announcement of a $2 trillion infrastructure plan, which embedded in the not very fine print, laying out kind of the strategic goals of this massive uptick in infrastructural investment, are two key long-term aims to fight the greatest challenges of the era, as it puts them. One of which is climate change, and the other is, quote, to contain the ambitions of an autocratic China. And I think that the inclusion of that particular aspect in a policy like this merits further exploration, because when we think about infrastructure, right, when we think about the actual sort of built environment of production and circulation and exchange within a country like the United States, that's bound up in an affective way, and in terms of the associations that people make, very strongly with notions of national strength, right, in terms of the actual robustness of the physical built environment, right? And for that reason, when you hear when you hear politicians in both mainstream parties talking about, for example, America's decaying infrastructure, right? When you think on Trump's inaugural address and his reference to quote unquote American carnage, sorry. You kind of realize that there's a lot invested in this kind of more abstract notion of national strength that is embodied in infrastructure, and to identify China as a threat to that really speaks to kind of a through line in the way that the United States has treated China and has treated Chinese people and people coded as Chinese. Extending back centuries, namely that China and immigrants from China, right, or people who look Chinese, are at the very core an essentialized foreign threat to the strength of the United States, considered in several ways, right, as like an actual bearer of weakness, of disease, of filth, of addiction and dependency. You see this in terms of the 19th century Western characterization of late Qing dynasty China as the quote sick man of Asia, right, which combined all of these associations with weakness, with dependency, with addiction, completely, of course, ignoring the reality that insofar as that reflected the actual conditions of China at the time, those were conditions that were induced in large part by Western imperialism, right? By the Opium Wars, by all of these sort of humiliating, unequal trade policies that were imposed on China by its actual partial dismemberment into foreign concessions, and then with the figure of the Asian immigrant, of the Chinese immigrant in particular. You had this idea that some of that sickness, right, some of that disease, was actually being like transported and implanted almost into the American body politic, right? That kind of language runs through all of the specifically anti-Coolie, anti-Chinese immigrant rhetoric that you saw during that era, and it it took obviously very gendered forms, right? In the case of Asian men in general, there's a direct line from that to this, perception of Asian men as effeminate, right? As not fully masculine, as submissive. And in the case of Asian women, as Amanda and Sheila have already, explored in so much detail, took a sort of highly sexualized form, right? Like the same kind of submissiveness, but with that, added dimension, whose sort of full brutality really came to light with the Atlanta shootings. But now, right, the current geopolitical situation is that China is coded as presenting again a threat to the strength, the integrity, the purity, right, of the American nation, but from a position now of China's own strength, right, of the developmental model that China has pursued really since the 1949 revolution in different phases. First sort of building up a really sort of robust educational, medical, and industrial infrastructure during the Mao era, through a really sort of state-driven like developmental model that formed then the basis for the reform and opening policy of the past 4 decades or so, which has involved sort of a strategic invitation to Western, right, foreign investment in China, conditioned on technology transfer and informed by a long-term strategy to build up the domestic productive forces in China to the point where it could assert itself once again as a global power and move itself up on the value chain, really start getting into these high-tech sectors and eating into the amount of surplus that U.S. and other sort of Western-based multinationals could extract from their investments in China, and this is instantiating itself as well, right, in all of China's efforts to essentially build an alternative economic bloc to the one that the U.S. dominates so thoroughly with its regime of dollar hegemony, its control of the international trade and financial apparatus, its ability to punish any recalcitrant government with suffocating and genocidal sanctions. China is offering an alternative to all of that. And really posing to the U.S. A threat to its global hegemony that certainly exceeds anything that we've seen since the Cold War, and in terms of the robustness of the developmental strategy behind it, perhaps even exceeds the material, if not necessarily yet the ideological challenge posed by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And so the U.S. is now returning to that trope of China and of Chinese people as an agent that is attacking in every respect the national sort of strength of the United States through what are inevitably characterized as underhanded methods, right? From the right, of course, you have this line that basically China and Chinese people are carriers of COVID, right? This conspiracy theory that COVID in fact emerged from a lab leak in Wuhan, whether intentionally or not, as some sort of like dastardly plot to weaken the West, which of course has been hit much harder due to its own emaciation of its healthcare system and its overall social welfare system under neoliberalism. But there are elements of this rhetoric as well coming from the Biden administration. Again, in terms of its attitude toward the WHO investigation into the origins of COVID, and across the board. If we return to the idea of infrastructure, right, and particularly critical infrastructure that is, under threat both from Chinese competition and from alleged hacking that is a concern that is expressed at fever pitch across the political spectrum of China as a security threat. And I've been speaking for a while, so I think I have some further points about essentially the ways in which criticism of China's domestic policies plays into that imperialist narrative, posing China as a security threat. But for now, I'll leave it there.
I just like to kind of riff off on what you said, Charles. I mean, it's pretty obvious for anyone who's been paying attention that what the U.S. foreign policy is intimately tied with anti-Asian racism inside the United States. We have right now, the United States is setting up China as this alien civilizational enemy. We had the State Department official of Trump administration publicly said, for the first time, U.S. has a great power competitor that is not Caucasian. I mean, she was just saying the quiet part loud. And right now we have all these represented, even like the Asian American congressmen have publicly come out on Twitter saying, my family have immigrated here for decades. I was born here, but my children are being told to go back to China, or they have been called a Chinese boy. I mean, what do you expect? And this is a natural consequence of U.S. making China to be the number one enemy, and this is often done in a way to both to protect U.S. hegemonic position in the world, but also to distract from failures in the U.S. domestic front. And China is a very convenient scapegoat, and it's there's so many pundits right now. They're trying to say, oh, you can be against the anti-Asian racism and anti-Chinese government at the same time. I think for anyone who have experience living in the United States, you will know the average American do not make such a distinction. We have East Asian people now, or not even East Asian people, just people with East Asian appearances getting attacked in the United States. We have Filipinos, we have Burmese, we have Thai, we have Hmong, we have all these various ethnicities who are being attacked just because they are East Asian presenting, and this is not. And people are going to say this has nothing to do with the U.S. the xenophobia narratives being promoted by U.S. media that's being directed from the top by the White House and the State Department. I mean, that's preposterous.
And I would like to add something, if you guys don't mind, about how there are some people who say we're against the Chinese government but not the Chinese people, and that on the surface it seems valid, and it is valid in the sense that, okay, you don't have to be a fan of the CPC, but here's the issue: the people who typically say that do so while in effect their positions are really defending imperialist aggression, the encirclement of China and the undermining of its sovereignty. That's the main thing over there. Because if you really love the Chinese people, then if you are against the government over there, then you should be in support of letting the people practice their self-determination and fix the country the way they see fit, and not push for destabilization. Because we see destabilization efforts, oftentimes they're done, under the guise of helping the people, spreading human rights. But I mean, look at Libya, look at Iraq. Just in recent history, have they become better after U.S. destabilization and coups? No, they have not. So if you really care about the well-being of Chinese people, then you should really be pushing against your own government's aggression against China, and let China work out its own issues.
Indeed. Does anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I would love to jump in if I can. I really appreciate everyone's comments, and I think everything of what Charles said, what Xiangyu said, what Carl said, really gets at the U.S. attitude against China after 1949, after the revolution, right? The age-old question was who lost China, as if China belonged to anyone in the first place. And I think it speaks to, once again, this American exceptionalism that our government has the right to go into any country on the basis of human rights, and we know that that's untrue, or that's very, very dangerous for the rest of the world. But I wanted to take it a step back. I think that we've kind of made the point that COVID-19 scapegoating of China was not necessarily the beginning of anti-Asian racism. It really is the detonator that set off what is a legacy of anti-Asian racism in the US. And it really is tied to this like military strategy against China. And even if you are anti-CPC, just as my co-panelists have made the point, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, our government, the US government, weaponizes racism to further its war agenda. So if you are for Stop Asian Hate, anti-Asian racism in the US, you have to stand against war. You have to stand against US aggression. This is a fact. And just to kind of highlight how egregious this is, there was a protest here yesterday, actually, in a suburb of Los Angeles called El Monte, which is a very working class neighborhood of Latino and Asian communities. And it was, for the first time, I think, where the community came together and just like demanded an end to this like racist violence that we're seeing against the Asian American community, many of whom are working class and very vulnerable. And there were anti-CPC counter protesters who were there and basically like stood on the side against racism, or not against racism, to make the point that it doesn't matter, the CPC is evil, it's terrible. And in fact, they even like stole a Chinese, like forced a Chinese flag out of the hands of a Chinese national, Chinese patriot. So like, how is it that we can make this distinction on racism and like justify like, oh, but we can't be for the CPC, but then counter that with like what is a very real racist violence happening against Asian American people. So I just wanted to make that point.
Oh, it's very common, whenever I talk about anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian racism in the US, I often get commenters say, oh, but Chinese government do this, but Chinese government does this. I'm like, I'm talking about domestic issue happening in the United States that has nothing to do with China. And you are here jumping out and justifying essentially the action of this racist attacks by saying, oh, Chinese government may have done something. You're already making this association. And I think it's ridiculous for some of these liberals who say, oh, you can do, why can't you do both? Why can't you be also opposed to the Chinese government, but at the same time anti-Asian racism? No, that's hardwired in American people. They really don't make the distinction. I'm sorry to say. I mean, that's why we have Korean Americans being told to go back to China. It's just ridiculous to think that all this xenophobia has zero impact on all these anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian violence that really exploded in the last couple of years.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. If I could.
Well, let's. Yeah, Charles. How about you, Charles, and Xiangyu? You can jump in.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, if I could quickly sort of pick up where Sheila left off. I think that this is a point that really needs to be hammered home more, which is that I think a lot of people look at sort of all of the attacks that are lobbed against the Chinese government, and implicitly sort of stratify them on the basis of like how harmful is this, right, to the cause of peace, right, of mutual understanding, and of sort of limiting and combating the racist narratives that occur in the U.S. And sort of this top tier of attacks that I think there's broader consensus around. Okay, these are actually harmful, are the ones that pose China as a direct threat to, for example, the national security or the national interests of the U.S. Right. So this would involve the attacks on Huawei and ZTE and other sort of Chinese tech companies, conflating them with sort of Chinese government hackers. It would include, sort of the actual militarization of the Asia Pacific and the posing of China as a direct military threat, and it would include sort of the COVID narratives as well, right? This idea of COVID as like a Chinese bioweapon or something like that. And then implicitly, it's understood that there's that top tier which needs to be confronted head on, and then there are all the criticisms wall to wall that you see in Western media of the Chinese government's domestic policies, right? You can think here in particular of Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang. And I think there's a real reticence to sort of push beyond combating that top tier of narratives and going into sort of overtly countering propaganda surrounding Chinese domestic politics. Because at the end of the day, it's that sort of second tier of critiques that people really fall back on, right? Because when it comes to posing China as a direct military threat, that's just untenable on the basis of history. The last war that China waged outside its own borders was in 1979. It was a brief border skirmish with Vietnam, which most people in the West are not even aware of. In the more than 4 decades since, China has not waged a single war outside its borders, whereas of course the U.S. has intervened across the world, particularly in that period in Central America and obviously the Middle East, at the cost of millions and millions of lives. So that's just absurd on the face of it, which is why there is so much emphasis on Chinese policy in Hong Kong and Tibet, in Xinjiang, and posing China as a threat to Taiwan as well, because it's really a way to sort of turn Chinese domestic policy into or to incorporate it into a narrative of China as an external threat, right? It poses the Chinese government as an external threat, as an external oppressor to its own citizens in these sort of peripheral areas of China itself. It completely erases and obviates the actual nuanced history of Xinjiang and Tibet, and particularly the colonial history of Hong Kong and Taiwan, and poses China as an external aggressor there. Which has several effects, right? One is that it basically plays into this completely false narrative that the People's Republic of China is a Han ethno-state, right? That it does not treat Tibetans and Uyghurs, for example, as fully equal citizens of a multi-ethnic republic, which in fact it does, and therefore, and in the case of Hong Kong, right, by obviating the colonial history there, it can in fact completely invert the situation and treat China's assertion of sovereignty over literally this piece of land that was stolen from it by Britain as a colonial venture in and of itself, and so therefore it's kind of a two-step process where China is posed as foreign to elements of its own population, right, and as an external threat to the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, et cetera. And then the line goes, okay, look what China is doing to them, right, as in invading or in occupying power allegedly, that they will do to you, because they have this imperialist and expansionist drive. And that is what makes it open season on Chinese people or everyone who looks Chinese in the West itself. And I think that, you know, yeah, like for that reason, the questioning of Chinese sovereignty over its own territory, you know, is very much an integral part of this project. You know, the whole human rights narrative is very much embedded in it. And it's richly ironic, right, to you know, contend that China does not have legitimate sovereignty over any part of its territory, when most of those critiques are coming from white Anglo-settler colonies that have no legitimate claim to any of the territory that they claim.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Those are very good points. I know Xiangyu, and then I'm going to jump in to kind of break, and then we can continue. We'll probably be on for another hour, maybe a little bit more than that. So, Xiangyu, please.
So, yeah, excellent points, Charles. You're the embodiment of the Chinese idiom 手菜莲花. Anyways, so to add to that, remember Biden came out and said that anti-Asian hate is bad, but you know, actions speak louder than words. I mean, the U.S. is actively engaging in a new war against China, in which the opponent, you know, is Asian, and by doing so, a message is spread that Asians are a threat and a valid target of hate. It's kind of like when Bush came out and spoke out against Islamophobia. It didn't really do much because the U.S. was actively invading Afghanistan under the guise of, you know, liberating the women from the Taliban and spreading democracy, which basically like told people, you know, that Muslims are inherently backwards barbarians that need to be civilized by the West. And we can see that it wasn't just Muslims who were impacted by this, but basically anyone who was brown, especially anyone brown who wore a turban, like Sikh Indians, they were targets of hate crimes, even though they're not Muslim. Not saying that, you know, like hate crimes against Muslims are bad. And another thing is, you know, like these people who are anti-China and then like use issues like Xinjiang and Taiwan as their little tokens to justify their hatred of China, which fuels anti-Asian racism, is this. They like to speak of, for example, they bring up Taiwan and then they act as if the U.S. is there for Taiwan's interests. Well, I just wanted to, if it's okay for me to just spend like 2 minutes talking about this, Danny.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I just want to remind people, the first country to ever attack Taiwan with a warship was the U.S. in, I believe, 1867. And the country that supported Japan in invading Taiwan during the Mukden incident was the United States in 1874. The country that sold weapons to Japan during the First Sino-Japanese War, leading to China's defeat, forcing China to cede Taiwan to Japan in the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, was the U.S., you know, from 1894 to 1895. And the country that actively pushes for Japanese containment of China and the Taiwanese containment of mainland China is the United States. From the 19th century until today, the Taiwan Relations Act, which, by the way, is a unilateral U.S. law, states that it is the policy of the U.S. to provide Taiwan with arms of defensive character. Nowhere in the English language does the word provide imply the sale of something. But then we had this case where the reactionary administration of Taiwan is basically providing serving as like the U.S. line of defense against what back then it was like the front line of the Cold War, but also like paying for weapons at the same time. It's like, okay, if you want me to be your running dog and your like kamengo, like guard dog, you should be giving me like kibbles, not me paying for them. Anyways, we're being used to serve U.S. interests, and yet we're still it's just ridiculous. And then like mainland China's WS-2 missiles cost what, like $10,000 to produce, whereas a single Patriot missile costs Taiwan $3 million, and it takes 3 Patriot missiles to intercept a WS-2, meaning it costs $9 million to intercept each missile that costs only 10,000. I could go on, but it's like the U.S. is not our friend.
I wanted to add to that. Do we have time or?
Yeah, no. Yeah, I'm just gonna, whenever people do not have anything to add, I'll just break with a few points in, and whoever needs like a bathroom break or whatever can do that.
Okay. I just want to add to what Xiangyu had said. The Yellow Peril narrative actually started with the U.S. imperialism in China, and specifically against in Asia, but specifically against China. Because this is when U.S. came to Asia, U.S. always had this unhealthy obsession with China. And in fact, what brought U.S. to East Asia in the first place was to trade with China. And at that time, was the one commodity that U.S. Found most profitable to engage in was opium. Many people know about Opium War and the British involvement with the opium trade, but many people, including many Americans, didn't know about the American role in the opium trade. In fact, British at the time, British control about 90% of the opium trade into China, and United States controlled the other 10%. U.S. merchant from New England, they would go to Turkey and ship opium to China, smuggle opium into China through Guangzhou. In fact, most of the U.S. Old money in the East Coast came from the opium money. Like we have the grandfather of FDR, Warren Delano. He made his fortune in the opium trade. We have the Forbes family. Started out with John Forbes making money as an opium smuggler into China. All the U.S. All the U.S. Famous universities like Harvard, Yale, they have been originally endowed with opium money. So U.S. This is tied with the U.S. history from the very beginning. And then following that, in 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion, U.S. Marine actually participated in the sacking of Beijing. So while U.S. is sending its Marine to breach over the city walls of Beijing, that's when the Yellow Peril narrative gained popularity inside the United States. Psychology just could probably has a lot to say about that. While you're brutalizing your victim, and at the same time you are conjuring up this scenario where this you're under threat from this hordes of yellow invaders, right? The yellow horde. I think it speaks from the position of a guilty conscience, and that has been the U.S. narrative on China from the very beginning. There's a lot of projection. Nowadays we talk about the U.S. media tend to focus on the Chinese human rights violations. So for example, the concentration in Xinjiang, right? We have real concentration camps in our border. We have children being locked up in cages, right? But let's focus on China. Let's focus on what may be happening in Xinjiang with some very flimsy evidences, and then we talk about the forced labor, for example, in the Xinjiang cotton, right? When U.S. itself has a history of slavery and cotton, right? So whenever we talk about China, it's not necessarily we're talking about whenever U.S. media is talking about China. Sometimes they're not really talking about China as the country that's across the Pacific. There's a lot of projection. China is often used as a foil to United States itself, and this continues today. We just have the updated version of the Yellow Peril narrative now. Now we just have, instead of Chinese immigrants coming over bringing plague, we just have coronavirus. We call it China virus.
Yeah, thanks so much. Amanda, can you be the first one? I just want to just break it and make someone else. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Keep your thoughts. Just 1 second, just so I can get in here. Well, first, the stream has been amazing so far. You all have brought, your perspectives, your knowledge of history, politics, all of it, and I feel like we've gone so much. So we were halfway through. I see people in the chat asking for donations, for example, where to donate. I don't monetize the channel, so the best way to donate is either through subscribing to my Patreon in the description or going to Black Agenda Report and sending a donation to blackagendareport.com. A reminder, the No Cold War campaign has an event on April 10th, and the Eventbrite is in the description. We are going to be talking about a peaceful Pacific. Activists, organizers, scholars from Guam, Okinawa, and across the world will be coming together to oppose U.S. and Western interventionism, particularly this new Cold War on China. And don't forget about Black Alliance for Peace's Day of Action, April 8th. And you can find at blackallianceforpeace.com/Day of Action Afghanistan all kinds of materials to participate in that, because again, we're talking about Asia here. The U.S. war in Afghanistan is not only an invasion of Afghanistan, a complete destabilization effort of the region, but it's also directed at China in many ways. So with that said, don't forget to like, share, tweet this out, get out the stream. I see a lot of people here, and thanks for spending Easter Sunday with us. I want to just bring up one connection, because someone in the chat a long time ago mentioned Bill Maher. He had this segment where he kind of boasted about how China is the adult in the room. It doesn't care about social issues, right? It's like it was an underhanded attack on China in the sense that China is the adult in the room, doesn't care about social issues, doesn't talk about human rights. It's just getting things done. It's a lot. He mentioned a lot of facts about poverty alleviation, infrastructure development, basically saying that China is cleaning the U.S.'s clock in these areas. Not untrue. But he made one comment that I think is just indicative of this whole posture that's so important to dissect as being connected to racism and this rise of anti-Asian racism in particular, or this remanifestation, as you said, Carl, and its connections to all sorts of other aspects of U.S. and Western history and contemporary politics. And that he said China also bought Africa. He made this point, right, to demonize the way that China and Africa relate to each other. But we never hear about the United States remilitarizing Africa, virtually recolonizing Africa, placing military installations and bases through U.S. African Command, which occupy now nearly every single African country. And the entire strategic goal of AFRICOM is to contain China's influence on the African continent, its economic activity. It's not really working, but you never hear that kind of equivalency even made, or privileging the fact that the United States is committing actual atrocities, as Carl said, on the border. But we can also go back to this siege mentality. The United States and the West, whenever the United States and the West are conducting imperialist ventures and also occupying and employing oppressive means and activities within its own borders, the U.S. always has to paint itself under siege. We heard, Sheila, you mentioned American exceptionalism, and others have as well. There's also this inherent innocence, too, to the United States and the West, in that all the crimes that it commits are justified because the U.S. and the West, they're always under attack, right? Always. Terrorism. We can go back in history, right? As the U.S. and the West, Great Britain, the British Empire at the time, was placing China in this century of humiliation, the U.S. was justifying Jim Crow through what? The siege of Black Americans freed from slavery, now disrupting white society, disrupting the settler colonial order. And in a lot of ways, lynching was justified because Black people were portrayed, especially Black men, were portrayed as attacking white society through the violence, mythical violence toward white women. And we saw thousands and thousands of cases where Black people were killed, hung up on the trees because of this siege mentality. And it's the same now today with China. China is out to take the US's lunch. China is taking everything from the United States, its hegemony, its superiority. And I think this remanifestation of anti-Asian racism cannot be disconnected from this attempt, this desperate attempt to maintain superiority and hegemony in a period where it's obvious China is growing. China is on this different path from the United States that, short of war, cannot be disrupted. You're not going to disrupt it with sanctions. You're not going to be able to disrupt it with propaganda. But that's why it gets louder and louder, and these policies become more and more aggressive. But I want to bring it back to you, Amanda, after those points. And I wanted to make sure that you got your thoughts out.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to a couple of points that Carl made. He made a really good one about how China is often used as a foil for the U.S. and how the U.S. often projects itself onto China and blames it a lot for things that it's guilty of doing. And there have been a number of cases throughout the pandemic where this was true. In the beginning, the U.S. They lobbed a lot of accusations at China for covering up its numbers, the number of COVID cases, and it accused China of silencing whistleblowers. But, that happened in the US. There was a case of a Florida data scientist named Rebecca Jones who looked at the numbers and in the system, and she realized that they didn't match up with the real numbers, and she was arrested. And, there were cases where, the U.S. would release a number of COVID cases, and then it would go back and sort of refine that number. But it was never framed in like a nefarious way, the way that it was with the case of China, And if you ask the experts, they'll tell you that you can't get a really reliable number in the beginning because there are just so many like unknowns and factors involved. So when something like this happens, the numbers are always revised retroactively to include like hospice deaths and deaths that people dying at home that maybe weren't counted in the first numbers. And Carl also brought up the case of the U.S. recently focusing on human rights in Xinjiang. And I think what's important to point out in the case of Xinjiang is that it's a key area in China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is like a land trade route that would sort of like ship goods from China to Europe without relying on the maritime trade route that is currently dominated by the US, right? So as of right now, Europe is the number one trade partner with China. And in order for China to ship its goods over there, it has to go through the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And it has to stop at all of these like military checkpoints, US military checkpoints. And if the US wanted to, it could, blockade its port in Singapore. And that, if in the event that the US and China went to war, it could like blockade the Malacca Strait, for example, and it would cause the entire Chinese economy to collapse. So China has developed this Belt and Road Initiative, which is a land trade route. Instead of going through the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, it goes through Central Asia, through Xinjiang, into Europe, and it would, ship goods there, in 2 days. So that's a large part of the reason why there has been such a strong emphasis on the part of the U.S. government and U.S. media on Xinjiang.
This reminds me of why the U.S. invaded part of why the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. I'm not sure about the audience, but I know some of you guys and some of the audience know about the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. Now, what's the second country in that pipeline? Afghanistan. So yeah, there are economic factors that people ignore, and then they try to retroactively justify everything with phony like human rights claims. And do you trust that little fuckwads at Raytheon-sponsored think tanks like ASPI, like Nathan Rooser, really care about human rights when they're more concerned about the rights of the people in a country they have little or nothing to do with, while speaking very little about, the human rights issues and the legacy of settler colonialism and stuff like that in their own countries. I mean, in the case of Nathan Rooser, why does he always whine about Xinjiang but hardly ever talk about the past and present treatment of indigenous Australians? Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Well, he was talking about our panel, so maybe he's watching right now. Hi, Nathan.
Hi. Hi, Nathan.
Hey, Nathan.
Speaking of Nathan Rooster, I just want to add my 2 points. I actually know this guy from Twitter, from back in the days of Syrian war. He made his name as a high school student, making satellite imagery and maps to track the Syrian war. And he was a big supporter of the so-called moderate rebel faction in the Syrian civil war. And of course, they all turn out to be controlled by Al Qaeda affiliates and jihadis, and including the Turkestan Islamic Party, which is largely Uyghur jihadist organization affiliated with Al Qaeda, based themselves in Idlib. I started noticing around when the Syrian war started to wrap up around 2016, 2017. Suddenly, Nathan Rooster started to tweet a lot about Xinjiang, and I was really confused at that time because before that he was tweeting exclusively about Syria, and I know that he has no experience in Xinjiang. He doesn't speak Chinese. He doesn't speak Uyghur. He was just looking at all these satellite pictures of Xinjiang, and next thing I know, he got hired by ASPI. As many of you know, is this supposedly Australian think tank, but is actually majority funded by U.S. weapon manufacturers and U.S. State Department and UK Foreign Office. So yeah, totally neutral party. And there's another Australian news media report which pointed out that ASPI, the think tank, produced majority of the anti-China content in Australian media in the last couple of years. And for their effort, ASPI recently, they brokered a deal between the government of Australia and U.S. weapon manufacturers. So government of Australia actually purchased anti-ship missiles. I forgot was it from Lockheed or Raytheon, one of the ASPI sponsors, and ASPI got a nice nifty finder's fee. But why does Australia needs anti-ship missiles? The stated aim is to defend against China. But of course, Australia's largest trading partner is China. It's like I recommend everybody to check out this Australian comedy sketch called Utopia. It's on YouTube. They actually did a sketch about this a few years back. I mean, it's just very prescient. They had supposedly a meeting of Australian defense officials. Like we're asking for an increase of $400 million increase in our defense budget. But why? Okay, so how about protecting our trade route? Who is our number one trading partner? China. So we're protecting our trade route with China from China. That's literally what's going on right now. And people like ASPI, all these grifter think tanks, they are hyping up tension. They're selling xenophobia for pure reason of grift. So they can rake in all these sponsors, their sponsor money, from taxpayers, and we're all in along for the ride. I mean, people need to open their eyes to see what's going on, who are behind, who is peddling all these xenophobia narrative, right? Who are these main actors? Look at their sponsors. Look at their funding sources. It's quite eye-opening.
Follow the rich white man.
Yes. Yeah, follow the rich white man. Well, let's talk about the left, right? In the United States, the West. They've the large section. I know a lot of you have interactions or organized directly with, or just struggle each and every day with this. So So what explains this? I know, Xiangyu, you had some thoughts about this, but Sheila, maybe if you wanted to jump in first on this question, because I feel like what Carl just talked about with these sponsors, these think tanks. I know our friend Daniel Dumbro calls them think tankies. We're the tankies, they're the think tankies. But when it comes to these think tanks, ASBI, the New Lines Institute, they were very angry about this panel happening. But they have, just like others have mentioned, a lot of their staff, just like Nathan Rooser, Michael Weiss, who's a senior editor over there, he posed with jihadists in Syria in 2012, a longtime Israel lobbyist. But when you look at the figures who are leaders of these think tanks, editors, etc., what does that say, Xiangyu? AOC? Okay, yeah, well, we can talk about that too. I know there's a lot of opinions here, so I think this is an important conversation, though, because we really are, right now we're in a Democratic Party administration in the United States. I know Europe is on this extreme, they have kind of more far-right leadership in many ways, but a lot of also liberal leadership. But in the United States in particular, it is this kind of lull point. The Democratic Party is in office now. But the left, whether it was Trump or Biden now, Obama before that, largely, or whatever we consider the left, largely in league with the new Cold War on China, with all of these narratives, which we have all argued contribute to this remanifestation, escalation of racism. But Sheila, maybe you first. I see you, Carl. I know Xiangyu. I know all of you probably have opinions on this. So let's just go one by one. Sheila, you want to start?
Sure. No, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the Biden and Harris administration can pay lip service all they want to the Stop Asian Hate initiative, and they can denounce it as a moral judge of character, and they can cast all of that blame on Trump. But so long as our U.S. foreign policy continues to aggressively target China, which it clearly has, and it has ramped up even in the short 3 months that Biden has been in office, anti-Asian racism will never end. And I think this is really, really fundamental. And we know that, I think many of us on this panel understand that the Democrats are just as guilty of racist warfare as the Republicans. And U.S. aggression towards China, as we know, is really because of this like undisputed global supremacy that the United States has had for a while, for a very long time, and now it's becoming challenged by China's rise. And up until now, it's really needed to weaponize this whole human rights trope, this whole we have to defend Hong Kong, we have to defend Xinjiang, we have to defend Tibet, and then call China this evil dictatorship as a way to justify this war drive. This is really, anyone who lives in the United States knows that the U.S. doesn't give a rat's ass about human rights here. Just look at what happened after the pandemic. I mean, I don't even need to go through the numbers, but how can you say that 550,000 people have died from COVID is a result of China? And just given all of this kind of mischaracterization or this weaponization of human rights to justify war, well, Biden recently admitted that the rise of China and its ability to eclipse China will not happen on his watch. That's literally what he said. And with all of the Biden administration's attempt to separate itself from Trump, let's not forget that actually Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has stated that Trump's tough on China policy is something he does agree with Trump on. So this is what, as we know, the Republicans and Democrats are united on, is going after China. So, I think the Atlanta shooting, which did take place right in the middle of Blinken and Sullivan's travel through Asia, leading up to this historic Alaska summit with China, which we could talk about later. The goal really was to shore up an anti-China bloc in the Pacific. And then you have this $27 billion proposed budget for this deterrence fund against China for the Pentagon. This is obscene, right? I recently heard a statistic that basically says that all it takes is $25 billion to vaccinate the entire world. And this is a budget just specifically to target China. So this tough on China stance will not only continue under Biden, but in my opinion, intensify. And let's not forget that the pivot to Asia began under Obama, in which Biden was vice president too. And so in a situation where a hot war is possible, the US government needs the American people on its side to do just that. And so this can't happen without this continuing demonization campaign, and this like weaponizing of the Uyghur issue as a way to justify war. As we know, like anyone who has lived through the Iraq War understands that like the United States doesn't care about Muslims, not in the United States, never in the Middle East. Why would they care about Muslims in China?
Indeed, indeed. All right, so let's go around the horn then. Let's go, Carl. I know Xiangyu, you have comments, and then then the rest of the panel, Charles and Amanda, you can jump in.
When talking about left is a very nebulous term in the United States. I never understood why liberal is counted as left in the United States. And so, like in the United States, I feel like we have a centrist party, and a right wing party. A center right party and far right wing party. I mean, that's the choices we have in the United States. And in the end, like Xiangyu brought out AOC, right? You supposedly we are all energized by this progressive wing of the Democrats, and then it turns out they just get co-opted and do nothing. Nothing ever changes. Whereas compared to China, there's much talk in U.S. media about how China's early mishandling of Wuhan crisis led to, is to blame for the coronavirus epidemic. But I just like to point out, a lot of the health officials and a lot of the government local officials in Wuhan got fired. Did any public official in the United States got held accountable? No. I mean, nobody has been held accountable in the West for their mishandling of the COVID crisis, which killed over 500,000 Americans. I mean, the toll is still rising. So, it's just really ridiculous. It's like this bizarro world in the U.S. media when they want us to talk about China, it really distracts from the very real problems at home. Xiangyu.
So I would like to add, people who, there's a lot of people in the U.S. who call themselves leftists, but then and they might have good politics when it comes to, domestic issues, like, for example, pointing out Amazon's atrocious treatments of its workers. But then when it comes to the international stage, they fall very short, and they might be anti-imperialist in words, but to them, imperialism is like a very abstract concept. It's not something that they or their families have much experience about. So they don't really know what imperialism is, other than this like bogeyman almost. And a slogan I came up with is if imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, then anti-imperialism is the highest stage of class struggle. And I have an article that I wrote for Peace, Land, and Bread a year ago that goes by the title of Anti-Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Class Struggle. And if you don't mind, I would just like to read one passage from it.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So one part is sympathizing with, making excuses for, and objectively enabling U.S. imperialism on the international stage is similar to making excuses and objectively enabling white supremacy within the United States. We cannot overcome national divisions and form political solidarity within our class, the working class, without understanding and combating white supremacy. And we cannot expect international solidarity if we do not understand and actively oppose U.S. imperialism. Furthermore, it is nothing but chauvinism to expect anything less than perfection from other countries while turning a blind eye to the imperialist activities of the country we are in. To give an example, even if everything the mainstream media says about China were true, and this is not the case, but let's say what if? We must ask ourselves, who was threatening whom? Is it China or the US that has the other surrounded by military bases and client states? Is it China or the US that actively overthrows democratically elected governments abroad? And is it China or the US that actively props up military dictatorships throughout the world. Can we honestly say the two are just as bad as one another? Even if we have criticisms of China, like I personally do, should we not support the defense of their sovereignty from U.S. aggression, especially since we are in the United States and had the power to exert pressure on those who run things here? To draw the parallel once again between what the United States does internally with what it does externally, if we are able to recognize the false equivalence the U.S. legal system makes between the weak and the powerful when it claims there is equality before the law, then we must also see that those who claim the U.S. and Assad are just as bad as one another are really siding with U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, I just like to follow up on that. I mean,
well, sorry, Carl. Let's do Amanda, Charles, and then you. Is that all right? All right.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Xiangyu said. It's really the way that we understand racism in this country is just so completely removed and disconnected from imperialism. And just look at the slogan, "Stop Asian Hate." That's a really bad slogan to organize around. It just sounds like something that was focus grouped to appeal to the broadest section of people imaginable. It sort of positions racism as it positions racism as disconnected from U.S. military ambitions, U.S. imperialism, and instead says racism is something that is interpersonal, that is a matter of feelings or personal conflict. And, if you understand racism as something like that, then you'll think the solutions to racism are these sort of idealist solutions like more education, representation, or diversity panels. And for the most part, that's what Biden has proposed, right? He's created all of these task forces to try and figure out how to stop Asian hate. And that's what these are the solutions that a lot of these people are offering. And, what has representation really done for us? Nothing. This is just a way of routing resources to basically maintain the status quo.
Yeah, Charles, and then Carl. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate you bringing that up because I think that the sort of opportunistic, deployment of an anti-racist rhetoric from Biden, Kamala Harris, from the Democrats at large, and from the liberal establishment in this country is actually tremendously insidious, and in fact, part of a fairly sophisticated liberal counterinsurgency effort. And by that I mean that they have very effectively positioned the Republicans and Trump and his supporters in particular as like the sort of unique font of overtly racist rhetoric, right? They're perfectly happy to dunk on Trump for like the Kung Flu line for calling it the China virus, they're perfectly happy to stake their terrain of contestation on those grounds, and to pick up the anti-racist banner for themselves. And I think it's really worth examining the way in which they do so, because this is speaking for myself, not necessarily as a representative of Qiao, and I'm aware that this is a sentiment that may not be shared across the entire panel as well. But I think that treating, for example, the events in Atlanta through the lens of so-called hate crime is actually quite dangerous. And The reason is that, as Dylan Rodriguez, author of White Reconstruction, has pointed out, the very category of hate crime was invented by the FBI in order to individualize and pathologize, acts of violence that in fact are reflective of, a much more systematic and structural, institutional violence that, is part and parcel of the, American colonial and imperialist project, right? If you can bracket off, Robert Aaron Long, the Atlanta shooter, as someone who committed, this isolated hate crime, then you can very effectively, divert attention from the thousands and thousands of Robert Aaron Longs that are currently deployed, in uniform on U.S. military bases throughout the Asia Pacific region, right? Who either have, done as much or, would very much be happy to do so in those countries. And the other thing that it does, right, this focus on designating it a hate crime is it inscribes, the entire logic of how we fight anti-Asian racism into a carceral framework, and one that tends to strengthen the police state. And I think that, one major indicator of this is that I believe in New York, literally the president of the Police Benevolent Association, has on several occasions explicitly called for the use of hate crime enhancements in sentencing, Black people who, have committed acts of violence against Asian people, right? And so I think it's very transparent if you look at that example, that the category of hate crime is being deployed here inherently in an anti-Black way. If you consider the behavior of the police in those situations versus the Cherokee County Sheriff in the case of Atlanta, who resolutely refused to call the mass shootings there a hate crime, to impute any sort of racist motive whatsoever, and of course, really played into this narrative of the fetishization and sexualization of Asian women when he was talking about sex addiction as a motivation, and of course, very unsurprisingly was revealed to have shared anti-China sort of racist COVID memes on his own social media previously. But sort of zooming out from that case, right? I think that we really need to push back against, these tendencies to sort of carceralize our response to anti-Asian racism. We need to understand that it emanates from the state and will not be solved by the state, and that any appeals to that kind of legalistic framework for its solution are simply going to strengthen the police state, and in particular its anti-Black element. And sort of the bigger campaign that all of this is incorporated in, the liberal counterinsurgency campaign that I mentioned, is basically meant to position Biden and the Democrats as allies of an ill-defined sort of Asian community that is sort of being conjured into being in a way that very intentionally evacuates it of any of the radicalism and the third world internationalism of the original Asian American movement of the 60s, which identified itself alongside Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people in the United States, as well as all oppressed peoples in the global South, as part of a common, third world identity. What we're seeing in the U.S. basically with this anti-racist posturing is an appeal to our sort of Asian communities, right, and to an incipient sort of Asian political subjects to enlist us in the service of the U.S. carceral state and the U.S. imperial project. And a key part of that is both the the deployment of the hate crime narrative domestically, and as we've been spending most of this panel discussing, the renewed drive to war with China, wherein the expectation is that all of us will fall in line behind U.S. narratives and essentially, condemn the governments and the people of our home countries to the full force of U.S. aggression.
Yeah, well, I want to pass it to Carl, and then to end, we have we can go over. I definitely want to go over. I want to, after Carl, to leave time for everyone to kind of say anything that they feel like has not been said that they really wanted to get out today. But Carl, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to follow up on 2 points. One, what Amanda has said about representation, right? Yeah, representation does not work. We have been trying that for, how many decades? There was a case, a famous case of that Asian American veteran in Cincinnati, Lee Wong, who, during a board meeting, took off his shirt and show his battle scars from serving in the U.S. Army. I look into his story. I mean, if anything, this guy was an ethnic Chinese from Malaysia. He immigrated to United States to attend college, and then he was beaten up. He was assaulted by a white guy, and who called him a slur, called him a Jap. And then when he finally took the guy to court, the guy continually called him a Jap, even though he made clear in court who he is. And then the judge sentenced the other guy to like 8 months or 1 year in probation, not even jail term. And he was very angry, so he thought to join the police force. And then as he was walking away, he heard the policeman snicker and say, "Oh, this Chinaman wants to be a police," and then toss his application into the trash. And after that, what did he do? He went to join the U.S. Army, where he thought he finally found his calling, found his belonging. And he participated in 4 foreign wars. That's where he got his battle scars. And he even said, "Yeah, I was finally enrolled in the Army police because the Army commits a lot of crimes." It's like this person, he comes so close every time to realization, and then he do things that totally opposite. And this guy, a U.S. Army veteran who fought for U.S. imperialist wars with battles to show for it. And what happened? He comes back to U.S. He participated in the U.S. politics. He was elected to the board in his township. He became a police officer, became a police chief. He became a Republican, wears MAGA hats. MAGA hats. And he still got subjected to anti-Asian racism with people telling him to go back to China. I mean, if anything, this is a story that representation does not work. The Biden style of representation is they're just gonna have like a Chinese admiral of put in charge of the 7th Fleet to wage war in China. The problem is U.S. imperialism. That is a problem, and the Asian racism is just a manifestation. And this goes back to what Xiangyu said earlier about some leftists trying to both side this issue, right? What I want to say is that let's just forget what China is doing, right? Well, there's so much disinformation about China, so much ignorance about China in U.S. As U.S. citizens, we have so much more influence over the abilities to influence United States, the government of United States, than we have to influence the action of People's Republic of China, right? So regardless what China is doing, we can make most impact in inside US, and to fix all the issues that we know, we have firsthand experience. We actually have real information on, right? Those are more actionable items, right? Rather than get distracted by buying into the U.S. imperialist propaganda against a government that the U.S. government does not like. Let's focus on making United States a better place. I think that is a principled stand for the leftist. I mean, just let's forget about what China is doing. Like, you don't have to know what China is doing. Let's focus on fixing the cage. Let's get the kids out of the cages, right? That's something we can do here. Let's focusing on providing more healthcare to more people. That's something we can do. This is something what people in the well, actually, in the current system, you can there's probably nothing. Right now, the current system as it stands, the two-party system is designed that nothing gets done. But again, we still have more power inside the space of the United States than, say, some other parts of the globe where most of the people can't even find it on a map.
Indeed. And what right do people in the United States have, or the West have, in telling China how to conduct its affairs when there are so many affairs that the United States and its allies, the people of these countries need to work out? I mean, you just named some, but there are so many. Free speech, right? Everyone talks about free speech. How about Julian Assange? He's languishing in prison. Mumia Abu-Jamal, political prisoners. All of this is, these so-called values of the United States and the West of democracy. It's a sham, and we can see it in our day-to-day lives. And that is where people are going to become engaged in politics. And there's just no reason why, other than buying into the propaganda, buying into the war propaganda, that one would choose this to adhere to humanitarian intervention elsewhere, while the U.S. is spending trillions on wars and military bases and neglecting all of the needs of workers here and of poor people here. But I want to just give everyone the opportunity to, you can plug yourselves, of course, definitely plug what you're doing. But also, if there's anything that has not been said yet that you want to get out, please do. And I'll just leave it here. We have at least 20 more minutes. So,
could I make one suggestion before we start for everyone here? I think part of it is people don't really understand like Asian struggles in America, and also the racism that we've felt, and nobody faces the same kind of have the same experiences with racism. So I thought maybe some of us here, if you feel comfortable with doing so, maybe share some experiences you've had in these regards. I know all of you probably have some stories.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go around the horn then. Who wants to go first? It looks like Carl definitely wants to go first.
Okay, I'll go first. So I was born and raised in China. So I actually not too upset when people ask me where I'm from, or even people tell me to go back to China. Like, okay, but I came to China, to United States in 1990 when I was 13. I attended 8th grade, and then I went to high school. And at that time, I was living in Bridgeport, a little bit towards South Side in Chicago, and I went to high school in Kingwood Academy in far South Side Chicago, just outside of the University of Chicago campus. So I had to take like a 1 hour bus, 3 transfers to get to school every morning. And one morning, I was waiting for my bus in the snow in Chicago winter. A car full of white teenagers just drove by, stopped right in front of me, and spit in my face, and then they called me names and then drove off, right? And that's my first introduction to racism in U.S. That happened like a couple months after I landed, and like this kind of things. I have a friend who came around my same age who came to US around the same time. She lived in a Chicago suburb, and she claims she never faced racism, which I think is quite possible. But I don't think my experience is exceptional either. I mean, like, just because I think because I'm maybe because I'm in the city, and then I just with more people, and there's just more percentage wise, there's just more racists.
Yeah. All right. Let's go around the horn then, Charles.
Yeah, I actually want to directly follow Carl for a very particular reason, which is that I know you kind of stopped your personal biography at high school, but I know that you went on to do your undergrad at Caltech, the California Institute of Technology, which in fact is the institution that I recently left as a grad student. And I guess the sort of personal experience, or the suite of personal experiences that I wanted to share, was not so much about like overt expressions of anti-Asian bigotry, so much as a more subtle form of it that ties into a lot of these dynamics that we've been talking about during this panel during my time here at Caltech, which is that as China's strength and influence have grown, obviously discussions of it have penetrated into the discourse surrounding so many different spheres of policy, and including of science policy, STEM policy, right? And so very often in talks, particularly by like white academics, like you'll hear a passing reference to China that's couched in terms that essentially pose it as like an authoritarian society, right? That just does things differently from a policy standpoint than we do here in the free and open United States, and whose science policy in particular, right, is informed by that kind of nefarious scheming. There's a lot of scaremongering, for example, around the so-called 1,000 Talents program, which is basically an incentive structure for Chinese academics who, have like left China to go study and work and do research abroad, basically to bring their talents home, right? And this is posed, of course, as a security and an espionage threat to the U.S. But sort of leaving aside like the institutional scaremongering about that, which I've encountered here at Caltech, of which there's a lot, right? There's sort of two elements I want to focus on. One of which is that in all of their pro forma statements, in support of immigration, and in opposition to anti-Asian racism, for example, and particular policies directed against grad students and other researchers from China residing in the United States in particular, the Caltech administration has always like repeatedly harkened back to this theme that immigrants in general, and in particular foreign researchers, contribute to the economic strength and the national security of the United States, which implicitly says that you only have value to us, you only have a right to stay here unmolested by the state if you are essentially selling yourself and your talents to the continued imperial maintenance of that state's domination over the world, right? And its aggression against your own home countries in the case of the many researchers from China and Iran, for instance. So that's one example. And another is that whenever I hear these sort of ignorant xenophobic sentiments, like coded xenophobic sentiments, right, like always directed against the government and not the people, from white academics in particular, I will usually object, right? And basically put it to them that they are they're presenting a very one-sided view that's informed heavily by Western propaganda. And inevitably, the follow-up question is, oh, are you from China, right? The assumption is that, native-born U.S. citizen, unfortunate as I am to be such, who has spent the vast majority of their life in the United States, as I have, cannot possibly, believe things that are so contrary to the conventional U.S. wisdom about China. Since I've lived in the free and open West, I must be completely disabused of and impervious to the CCP propaganda, right? And there's an immensely imperialist and racist arrogance to that. The idea that we in the West have a privileged vantage point on China and access to information about China that people in China or people from China, right, like international students from China, do not. And implicit in that is the notion, one, that in order to be, a supporter or a critical supporter of the Chinese government, one has to, in fact, be a Chinese national, and two, that even if you have the talents or the critical thinking skills to get into a place like Caltech, if you are from China, that means that you have been brainwashed your entire life by this totalitarian regime, and you cannot possibly know what is supposedly going on in Xinjiang or Hong Kong or all these places that Westerners fixate on to no end. And that's immensely Orientalist. It's immensely racist. But it's such a pervasive attitude, and I think it needs to be directly addressed for what it is. I want to focus attention on that in particular because it really pulls in so many of the themes that we've been discussing.
Yeah, I want to get to Sheila. I know you were about to gear up to speak. I wanted to just say that no one has to do this. Thank you, Xiangyu, for bringing it up, but you don't have to do this. I'll definitely end it, but Sheila, go on and please give us your wisdom.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll just speak a little briefly of just my experience growing up as a daughter of Chinese immigrants, and a story that I think many second generation Chinese Americans can resonate with, which is, my parents, we had a very modest little Chinese restaurant in San Francisco, and was in the Black community of San Francisco, consequently one of the most deserted areas of San Francisco. There are actual highways that literally bypass this area. My mom, she still works in a factory, works a back-breaking job at a factory, and then has to work at a restaurant at our family restaurant after work. So this is from 6 a.m. till 10 p.m. every day. And so, my dad works in the Chinese restaurant industry now as a cook, and anyone who has worked in this industry knows you work at least 12 hours a day, 10 to 12 hours a day, all his life. And so imagine when COVID hit, let's not forget that Chinese businesses were the first ones to get hit because of the pandemic, right? My dad has been unemployed since January of 2020. And this is the reality of a lot of working class Chinese people. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this conversation we were having about the left in the US. And in my view, as someone who has been organizing around anti-war issues for, almost a decade, is that anti-war protests must also be anti-racist, right? This is the only way that we can win. And in fact, I think leaving behind this left that has what they believe to be a nuanced view of China, that attacks China but is anti-imperialist, well, that's just not going to resonate with normal working class people in the United States, right? People fundamentally understand this China bashing, and the people of this left who are anti-imperialist but anti-China, I don't know. To me, it feels like that's a dead end to organizing against imperialism. How can you fight anti-Asian racism without actually acknowledging these points? And I want to talk a little bit about the National Day of Action that the Answer Coalition had last week, which I participated in. And people really understood this point. I think what a lot of Asian Americans are really concerned with right now is yes, we want to stop Asian hate, but there's still no clear message of where this hate comes from. And so for us, when we had this rally under the banner of Stop Anti-Asian Violence, Stop China Bashing, I was actually pleasantly surprised at how receptive the crowd was to this messaging. So you could be as like anti-China as you want, but like when you're fighting against racism and you see all the headlines, it's people can make that connection. And I think what we do as organizers and as people who stand up against this issue, and as Amanda said, like we can't just stop at this like really like pointless direct like slogan, stop Asian hate, right? It doesn't tell us how to fight back. And so I think what we need to do is really talk to people, normal people who honestly are not even a part of the left, and make those connections. And I promise you, they're gonna understand it. And I saw it on March 27th, and I'm sure others who attended rallies saw this same thing. So I think, you know, when we talk about fighting against anti-Asian racism, like I think we have to give more credit to the people. I think they really do understand it. We just have to draw those connections.
Indeed, indeed. Anyone want to follow up, Amanda?
Yeah. Sheila, your family and mine, they have a lot in common. My parents also worked in the restaurant industry when I was a kid. And my mom is also a factory worker now, and my dad still works in restaurants. But to address Xiangyu's question of racism that we've experienced, I don't really want to get too much into it, but I will say that, you know, I would go with my mom to work when she was working in restaurants when I was a kid, if she couldn't find a babysitter. And I would see that a lot of the racism that was like directed at her had a lot to do with like the way that white men would fetishize her. Like as a kid, I would see all of these older white men just pay like an inordinate amount of attention to her. And at that time, I felt like there was something really wrong with it, but I was so young that I didn't, you know, I couldn't put my finger on it. And, you know, a lot of the racism that was directed at me as an adult and even as a kid had a lot to do with that. I won't get into it because there are like details that are quite personal, but that's what I'll say. One thing that I also wanted to bring up was the need to build solidarity, working class solidarity along or across racial lines. And I do want to bring up that the way that a lot of these assaults and attacks on Asian people have been framed by the media and by a lot of individuals has been one of like Black on Asian violence. And I think it seems like what's happening here is that the media will cherry pick certain incidents to make it seem like this is a phenomenon. But I was listening to an NPR report the other day, and the reporter mentioned this this researcher who had done research about this spike within the last year of anti-Asian assaults, and she had found that, you know, almost 90% of harassment was white people. 90% of the harassment that Asian people faced was from white people. And what's happening here is it seems like the ruling class and the media are cherry picking these certain incidents to incite racial division, right? And this wouldn't be the first time because, you know, that kind of solidarity is a threat to the state and a threat to the legitimacy of the state. And, you know, you can trace this back to the creation of the model minority myth, like back during the Cold War. You know, like in the 60s during the Johnson administration, they released the Moynihan Report, which, if you're not familiar with it, it was basically a report that the administration put out, and it was an investigation into like Black poverty and the reasons why it existed. And the conclusion was it basically blamed Black poverty on Black culture itself and placed the blame of their conditions on their culture. So around that same time, the ruling class and the media sort of started profiling Asian people and sort of started advancing this myth of the model minority, because it was also a time of like Black liberation struggles and, the civil rights movement, dismantling of Jim Crow. And so there was a lot of praise heaped onto the Asian American community because, here was supposedly this group of people, this group of minorities who were supposedly hardworking, family-oriented, embodied a lot of these like Protestant work ethic that Americans really valued. And they were able to achieve upward mobility without demanding any sort of policy changes or like political or social reorganization the way that Black people were. And so it was intentionally designed to drive a wedge between Black and Asian communities. And we're still suffering the effects of that from today, right? So a lot of people understand the Asian American community through this lens of the model minority. And it's particularly damaging because, while it's true that East Asians, there are some East Asians that are high income earners, right? But there are also Asian Americans who live in like who are really, really poor and live in poverty. Like there is a wide wealth disparity between these high income Asians and then the ones who live in poverty. So I think that, in order to build solidarity, we have to, focus on, ways that things that we have in common, for instance, Asian sex workers are targeted by police. They're subject to state violence. There have been Asian Americans as well who have been victims of police brutality. For instance, Christian Hall, he was a Chinese American adoptee in Pennsylvania, who he was having a mental health crisis late last year, and he was kind of standing over an overpass, suicidal, and someone called the police. And when the police arrived, they just shot him and they killed him. And the police put out a statement saying that Christian had a weapon and he had laid it on the ground, but then he, bent over to retrieve it, and he was pointing it at the cops, and that's why they shot him. But there's video of what happened. Like bystanders took video of it on their phone, and in the video you can clearly see that he had his hands up. He didn't have a weapon, and the police just shot him with his hands up. So there are points of unity that we can unite across and build solidarity through.
Yes, indeed. Everyone here. I don't know if there's anyone else who wants to jump in. Okay, Xiangyu, and then I'll go, and we can close up after that. All right, if that's all right with everyone. All right, Xiangyu, go ahead.
So to add to the points that Amanda made, I think it's important to know that white supremacy impacts the way people think about the way everyone thinks about themselves, not just white people, but anybody, because regardless of who is carrying out individual acts of violence against Asian people or any other people for the matter, the any other racialized group behind for the matter is the ideology behind it is still white supremacy in a way, because every society has a dominant ideology. It's just the way society works. And the US is a white supremacist, capitalist, and imperialist society. So by nature of simply living in such a society and just consuming its media, going through its education system, and interacting with people who have, gone through the same system as well, if we do not actively resist these things, we'll internalize all of these different ideologies to a certain extent, and none of us are immune to this. So what ends up happening is even minorities will view people from other minority groups through a white supremacist lens. And to add to that, I would like to say that it should be obvious that Asians are not a monolith. We are quite varied when it comes to, national origin, class, language, and stuff. So then it's really funny when people who kind of just are anti-Asian racists just be like, oh, the Asian community is this, it's that. Well, there is no one Asian community, first of all. And a part of the dehumanization of us is to flatten us all into a stereotype false dichotomy, which kind of goes into the mono minority myth that Amanda talked about. And the first side of the dichotomy is we're backwards immigrants. And then on the other side is like we're totally whitewashed, white collar, white adjacent, rich class of people, like who are like Randolph Park. And so then on one hand, you have the you get the xenophobic people who hate us as foreigners, and then on the other, the portrayal of Asians as white adjacent and privileged, like without any nuance, is you get these quasi class conscious pseudo leftists to hate us all as exploiters. And I would also like to say that a segment of Asian Americans do push the second stereotype in an effort to not be seen as the first. And in the process, it kind of erases the struggles of working class Asians in America, who do in fact make up the majority of the Asians in America, by the way. I mean, how many of, I just want to ask the audience, how many of you know that many Chinese workers are actually undocumented immigrants? A lot of you, I bet, don't, because it doesn't fit into the whole white adjacent rich narrative. And there's another effect of this is another effect of anti-Asian racism is those who are not strong-willed enough end up internalizing it and hating themselves. And this further perpetuates anti-Asian racism when first-generation Asians receive hate from second and later generation Asians, including from their own children. I mean, growing up, this is what happened. As a kid, your first friends before you start going to school are going to be the children of your parents' friends. And, my parents being Chinese, their friends were also like in the Chinese restaurant community. And our first language was Mandarin. So, as kids, when we went to each other's houses and played video games and did this and that and just like, did kid things, we would speak to each other in Chinese because that was the only language we knew. And understandably, as some of the kids started going to school, because some of them are older than others, they'll start introducing English into the conversations, and then eventually the English to Chinese ratio kind of changes. But it's not just that. There's also another factor of I remember one time I was just hanging out with, it was like one of those like Chinese parent gatherings, and like the kids were like, the adults are downstairs like eating and like drinking and playing like mahjong and stuff like that, and the kids are upstairs playing video games and stuff like that. I remember one of them would just be like, hey, why are you speaking Chinese? As if like Asian, like being Chinese is something that's really uncool. That is a form of internalized racism. And a lot of times the diversity in America is really just phenotypical diversity. I mean, in American society, they'll accept you if you are sufficiently whitewashed. I mean, I remember when I was in middle school, I really liked listening to, just following Chinese pop culture and just things like that, because it's part of my culture. You know, I would watch some of the classics like The Bund, like Shanghai Tan, and also watch a lot of movies like Jet Li's like Once Upon a Time in China, or like Bruce Lee's like, you know, Fist of Fury or Enter the Dragon. Well, actually just all of Bruce Lee movies, because he didn't make that many before he died. And I would try to talk about these cool things at school, and then like all these classmates were just like, what the hell, this is like, it became like kind of something that they could just laugh at. And it also didn't help that I was always a kind of a weird kid. So yeah.
Well, thank you, Xiangyu. Well, you know, we've been going for 2 hours, and I think that this has been an amazing stream. I mean, I personally am just happy to connect with you all. It's been a long time coming. I know I've worked with some of you all individually, but I think this has been such an amazing conversation, and to end it with the personal is very important, because as we are all being attacked whenever anyone defends China as, you know, Communist Party agents and all of this nonsense, it's important to, I think, to recognize is that this is, I mean, first of all, this is a struggle for humanity's existence at the end of the day. Like, we're talking about an issue that really is at that level of struggle, and so we all have a stake in it, but especially those who are in the diaspora, who are experiencing both directly and indirectly this violence that is coming out, this blowback, this kind of internal violence that is mirroring this external aggression. I think it's so important. So, you know, before I end the stream, though, I wanted to just give a little bit about my experience, because, you know, I think when people look at me, they're like, "Why are you so into China?" Right? Like, there's a lot of, you know, there are a lot of reasons why I've decided to take a really firm stance and path toward defending China and all nations from imperialism. And it's because, in part, because I have experienced this kind of racism in my own life. When I was young, I looked a little less ambiguous, as some may see me now. I had the bowl cut, and, you know, I come from a family, a multiracial family. On my mom's side was Vietnamese, but I grew up in a multi-ethnic community, multiracial community in Boston that was not the Vietnamese community. So I was basically kind of on my own. You know, there were very few other Asian American, Asian diaspora groupings. It was mostly Black American, Haitian American. Then you had all sorts of white ethnic groups, Portuguese, Italian, et cetera, et cetera. And there was no escaping race or racism. And so in the schools, in the schoolyards, like, I've experienced many times being robbed, being jumped. And then a lot of it was because people saw me as this gook, this chink that has this connection to U.S. aggression abroad, this language of war. That's what racism really is. It's a language of war, and it continues to affect people to this day. And that's why we are having this conversation. So some particular experiences, though, I remember two that I want to talk about. One, when I was in school, I went to school with many working class Black Americans, many working class kids in general, and we would mess around. I mean, we, we didn't particularly like school. We didn't want to go to school. We didn't want to be there. And of course, most of the teachers were white, which is a very common thing. So we would be messing around, and of course, the Black kids would be getting in the most trouble. But a teacher one time came up to me and was like, "Hey, can I speak to you outside?" And she was like, Why are you messing? Why are you messing around with these kids? Like, you can do whatever you want. You can make it. In this society." And immediately, my first response was, "Screw you!" Like, I was just like, I don't know what you're talking about. But this was a pattern in my life. Kind of being seen as this exceptional kind of immigrant or race in in kind of contradistinction to the wretched of the earth, so to speak. Meanwhile, the poor kids, especially the poor white kids, would understand a lot what it meant for Asians to be inferior, and were always looking to be superior to me. So they would always be reminding me how inferior I was. So, as Xiangyu was saying, it's like living in these kind of dichotomies, kind of living between these two lines. And then There's experience I had more recently in my adult life, and this is where racism kind of is a thread, right? We can't really separate racism toward Asian Americans, racism versus toward Black Americans. You can't really separate them ideologically, because there was one time I was just walking the streets, and there was this drunk. He claimed himself to be a veteran of the United States, claiming I was Afghani and that he wanted to stab me. Yeah, like he was screaming in the middle of the street that he wanted to stab me because I was Afghani and he killed people like me when he was deployed. So that, I think that just shows that there is this almost insidious thread that you can run across when it comes to racism ideologically, and then in how it manifests, of course, differs across groups and across people. So I just want to say that, then to say that now we are in this moment where the United States is and its allies are so aggressively moving toward a scenario of outright war. I mean, we call it a new Cold War because it more accurately reflects the kind of policy orientation. But it's war. I mean, we're talking about flashpoints everywhere around the world that all lead back to the question of China and how China is going to operate in the world with a United States that is, and its allies, which they are seeing their twilight period, right? They are seeing a decline in all sorts of ways. And in any moment in history you can point to throughout the history of imperialism, whenever there is this twilight moment, this kind of decline for any of the Western empires, there has been this increase. There has been this escalation, at least, of racism, and then leading into fascism, which helps to recalibrate the system. So it's very important that we speak about this. But I just want to now, just say I want to plug everyone, because I know you all are very modest people. Definitely follow Carl at Silk and Steel. Xiangyu is all over social media. Red Rapper. Follow Amanda Yee, Radio Free Amanda with cat content only. Follow Sheila Xiao and all the great work she's doing at Pivot to Peace and in other areas. And of course, follow the Qiao Collective and Charles for all the great work that you're doing. Just two quick announcements again. Day of Action, Afghanistan. The Black Alliance for Peace is leading it. April 8th. You can find the link to all the materials in the description. And April 10th, 9 a.m. Eastern time, and then 2 p.m. British time, all that stuff. You can find No Cold Wars events on A Peaceful Pacific. The Eventbrite is also in the description. But yeah, is there anything that anyone wants to say to close? I don't want to close unless there's some thoughts that people have before I leave it. No? All right.
I can add something.
Wonderful. Yeah, add something, Sean. You go right ahead.
So since a huge part of our discussion, it goes back to imperialism. So I highly recommend, if you only read like one book, I would recommend Rogue State by William Bloom. That's Blum. Yeah, it's very eye-opening when it comes to like the extent of it kind of helps you understand imperialism not as a abstract concept, but from something that's very concrete and very real that continues to this day. And that book only covers imperialism, U.S. imperialism, since the end of World War II, and it's already just that alone is enough to kind of tell you what the true nature of imperialism. And I guess another announcement is, Carl runs Silk and Steel, and he and I are starting a series on the Korean War soon, specifically Chinese involvement in the Korean War, since the narrative we receive in the West is mostly from the U.S. perspective. And so make sure to check that out if you're interested. And he and I also have a series on the history of Taiwan's political development from like prehistorical times to like a Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, Japanese occupation, its return to China, and then like the aftermath of the Chinese Civil War and all of the internal developments since then to present day, which will also help you better understand cross-strait relations and China in general. So yeah, check that out. And then for those who are into pop culture, he and I did a recent episode on the short course of the history of Chinese hip hop. So
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. Well, we will all be, I'm sure, back together in some capacity again very soon. For those who want to, donate and help out with this program, the Internationalist Transmission and the Left Lens, you can find the Patreon in the description. You can also donate directly to blackagendareport.com. But with that said, to close, the U.S., the West, how many hundreds of millions have died from imperialism and continue to die, continue to be displaced, and live under this brutal form of exploitation. And here we are coming together, having to talk about how this is actually the reality, and that China is not our enemy. And I think at the end of the day, that's the conclusion we have to draw. But it was wonderful to be with all of you, to my amazing co-panelists, and much solidarity, and we're gonna keep fighting. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you for having us on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.